Bonjour, Kinamagi and Ireland and Dijnikas, and welcome to this production of Social Studies Explorer. Tonight's episode, the American Revolution, Advantages and Disadvantages. You should have received a piece of paper in your last packet that looks like this. It has predictions of British advantages and American advantages, British disadvantages and American disadvantages. I'd like you to take that paper and spend about 2 or 3 minutes just shorthanding your predictions in this area. Yes, we will talk about it, but I want you to go ahead and make those predictions. You should pause the video and unpause the video when you're ready to begin again. So go ahead and pause the video. Welcome back. Over the next 2 sessions, we'll be talking about the advantages and disadvantages each side had when coming into the American Revolution. Today, we're going to talk about this page here, and then we'll also have you doing some research on George Washington, who I may add lived at the place that is the background of this video. So, American military disadvantages. We were very inexperienced. The American military was largely made up of militia and a lot of farmers that joined in to the cause. They were not trained as an organized fighting force, and that's almost cost us the war very early on. It wasn't until later on that we are trained by some Europeans that come over and kind of teach us how to do this. The one advantage the Americans had is that they were good marksmen. We hunted. There were plenty of opportunities to fire a gun during the 1700s. British disadvantage, they had a hard time adjusting to fighting different ways. A lot of European battle strategy was let's line up, we'll charge towards each other, fire some volleys, a bunch of people die, and then we'll get up and we'll fire the next round. It was very much a suicidal way of fighting a war. You were going to lose most of your soldiers at some point. I've never really been certain of who thought this was a good plan in history, but it really wasn't a good plan. The advantage, though, for the British, it was known as the most powerful army in the world for a reason. They were experienced and they were well trained. But that training might eventually would kind of go against them when the Americans start fighting in different methods. Geography. An American disadvantage, fighting took place over a large territory. But the American advantage is fighting on their own land, so they knew the swamps and the forest. They had an idea of where things were going, what they were doing. This is especially helpful when you're not trying to line up in a battlefield across from the redcoats and hope that it's going to go your way. The British had the disadvantage of fighting in a large territory they did not know. If you know where the path or the stream's going to take you, it does give you an advantage. Of course, on the geography advantage, when battles took place at sea, they had the naval advantage. There was no question that the limited American naval forces were no match for the British. That's why it can be argued that the French Navy coming in late in the war was huge to our chances of victory. Supplies. The disadvantage is there was a shortage of food and other supplies, but we did have the advantage that France did help. We did make an alliance with the French. in Spanish to kind of because they looked at it as this way: their enemies are the British, so the enemy of their enemy is their friend. A British disadvantage is supplies had to come all the way from Britain. If you thought it was bad that you had to walk up the street to Sagamok to get something, try going 3,000 miles. It's a long ways. The advantage, though, is the British could actually afford the supplies that did come. So there is a positive there. Leadership disadvantage for the Americans. They had to train a group of new officers. We didn't have a standing military. Our military leaders are generally former British leaders and officers, such as George Washington, which we are listed as an advantage. But you could also add in that even as an advantage in George Washington, it's not until he gets some very capable assistants, and we're going to talk more about that later in the war, that George Washington really becomes a leadership advantage. The British had a disadvantage in the difficulty in getting information from leaders in Britain. You could not FaceTime or snap somebody or jump on IG Live and say, "Hey, what you doing over there? Why don't you move those soldiers up from Yorktown?" No, we write a letter, and a few months later, we get an answer. By then, a lot has probably changed on the battlefield. The advantage in their leadership uh, was that it had a very well trained, competent officer corps. Some other disadvantages for the Continentals: states often did not contribute money for the war. And in fact, they're not even states at this point. Uh, we're still kind of a disjointed operation. And we had this crazy idea: let's fight a war with no money. You can't really go to the bank and say, you know what, I'm going to need a whatever loan for a war. Doesn't work real well. And it's not like we can just start taxing people. An advantage on the American side is we got help from soldiers from other countries like France. And there's a lot of names that come across in roads throughout this country: Chusco, Lafayette. Uh, those are going to be some very advantageous people for us. A British disadvantages: they were fighting far from home. Now, yes, there were redcoat regulars that were already stationed in the Americas, but every soldier they brought from in other places, if they were coming from England, it's a 3,000-mile trip, 2 or 3,000 miles on a boat. Not a very pleasant day. Although they did hire mercenaries, and a mercenary is someone who is paid to go fight. It's not necessarily in their political interest one way or the other, but they're like, "Hey, pay me, I will fight for you." The Hessians were definitely one of those groups that we've talked about. So there are a lot of advantages and disadvantages both ways, um, and they will show themselves throughout the war. And as we watch different videos, and there are some really good TV shows, by the way, on History Channel and that you could kind of explore with this as well. All right, I'm going to scroll down past where we were just at, and I'm going to give you what your assignment is going to be today. I want you to take some time and Google George Washington. Things he did before the American Revolution. And these don't have to be written up as a paragraph. I'm not looking for a biography. I'm looking for biographical information. So, what did he do before the American Revolution? Was he a painter? Was he a poet? Was he an officer in the British Army? You look that up. Again, does not have to be in a formal writing. You kind of taking notes, and if you're doing it on this paper, you can write in here and turn this in. If you are choosing to do it via Google form, then you can fill that out there. What did he do during the revolution? And if the answer is he talked about this on Facebook Live, I'm going to cry. What did he actually do? And you could Google that term. What did George Washington do during the Revolution? What were characteristics? So, what was his personality like? Uh, what were his accomplishments? Like, what things did he do well? Um, and finally, any graphic features your text had relating to George Washington. If you see any pictures that are right on the top, this assignment was originally written as if we had a textbook, and we do via the Michigan Open Book, but Google is a very useful tool, and I'm encouraging you to actually use it on this case. So this is what you will fill out. Welcome back. Over my shoulder is Mount Vernon. That was the home of George Washington. It still exists as a historical location. You can visit here even today, although it's been a long time since I've been there. Not quite the 1790s, but more like the 1990s or late 80s, somewhere in there. So I have to visit it one of these days. So at this point, you can either fill out that paper using Google or Bing or whatever search engine you choose. Obviously, with a Chromebook, Google's the one that's right there. You can choose to write it on the paper. You could choose to fill out the attached Google form. That's up to you. Again, does not have to be in full sentences, but it's just to get some information and understand the leadership of the colonial army. If you have any questions, reach out to me at mireland@psychchipschool.net. Otherwise, I'll look forward to seeing you in class. Have a mental gives you God. Minwa Bama P.